this is the flow of the evening. We've done the intros. I'll do a quick intro to our speaker, who is Tim, who's sat next to between Joe and James over there. Tim will then do the main thing. If there's time, we'll do a Q&A, and then we'll wrap it up briefly, quickly, so we can have a beer and chat. The hashtag, if you are going to share stuff on the socials, is the Marketing Meetup. Okay, Tim Whirledge.
So thanks so much for having me. I'm actually quite nervous because this is the first time I've been out in the world presenting to normal people in a long, long time. Actually, most of my client presentations are still done virtually via Teams at the minute. I don't know if you guys are kind of still in that hybrid world of part IRL, part virtual. So it's great actually to kind of see you all in the flesh. And as Joe says, it's nice to smile and be responsive, but don't be like too smiley in the wrong places. I've pulled together a presentation on the 10 roles for advertising and the transition to net zero. It's a topic that I have been thinking about for a few years, and it's been kind of niggling away at what I do every day and the broader kind of ramifications and impacts that it have. And I think it's particularly acute if you work in planning and strategy, because a big part of your job is to think about the effect of the ideas that you're putting out into the world. And so I've kind of written this presentation through, I guess, like quite a personal lens, but there probably are some kind of wider like industry points of view in there as well. So yeah, a bit about me. So yeah, I've been in advertising in the creative agencies in London for the last 15 years. I've kind of worked in lots of different categories. My actual first job was my first job was working on the BP account at Ogilvy. And 2 years prior to that, the agency had come up with this concept of the carbon footprint to help kind of further BP's many agendas in the space. We'll come on to that. So that's me. I have been around oil companies. This is also me. I am around beef burgers quite a lot. So yeah, I eat meat. I am very familiar with the work of The Spin in Gatley and their burgers. And I kind of come at this from, and the reason why I say that is, the reason why I'm interested in this is not because I consider myself an environmentalist. I don't really consider myself much of an eco-activist, but I am really interested in people. And I'm really interested in what motivates them and what they're scared of, what they're afraid of, what their dreams are, what their fears are. And I think that's a big part of why I like working in marketing. And this was a story that kind of broke, I think it was about a year and a half ago, which was a story about Britain being host to its first coastal, its first climate refugees in a place called Fairborn on the west coast of Wales. And that story is about people not being able to get building insurance for their house, and so not able to get a new mortgage. And so the ripple effects of that have really nothing to do, in many ways, the stories that are generated out of that have nothing to do with polar bears. So I'm really interested in the climate and its intersection with how it will evolve how we think about our lives. And I think we're at this really amazing moment. So this is some data. This is a combination of some McCann data. We ran a survey tracker across the pandemic, and we asked people how they were feeling, around the world. And there were some really interesting kind of data points that were emerging around things like, when asked, people didn't really want to return back to normal once lockdown was over. So this was in April or May 2020. And then another survey from the Royal Society of the Arts kind of identified that 62% of people globally want to change their lives to reflect what they've learnt as a result of the pandemic, even when it's over. And I think that's really interesting because it's so easy now that we are emerging from the pandemic to forget a lot of the emotions that we were feeling when we were in the middle of it. So I kind of think before I get into the 10 things, like we're in this moment where we really shouldn't waste the crisis, because when a crisis hits, it's normally quite short-term in its effect, but it will often generate some long-term cultural repercussions. So as an example, if you think about the AIDS crisis in the 80s, that was a kickstart for the LGBTQ movement. World War II, the rise of the NHS, it created the conditions for the NHS to be permissible in culture. The Great Depression, Social Security. So I think my hunch is that this pandemic is going to create long-term cultural change and appreciation for climate action. And I don't think the way it's framed at the minute, broadly, around saving the planet, is actually what will motivate people in the long term to think about how they step up and save the planet. And so whilst this is happening this week, there's a lot of very important people thinking very strategically about the interventions that they are wanting to make on behalf of their populations. It does beg the question: what can we do? What is it that is within our gift that we can influence as us, marketers, advertisers, creative people, clients, agency, freelance, permanent, whoever you are in Manchester? What can we do? Because I think that's often a big blocker for a lot of people, is it happens, someone else is going to deal with it. Whereas actually the first point to acknowledge is we all have a responsibility. And actually, and I'll come on to some of the very specific influences that we have as an industry to really kind of push the industry forward. So I've got 10 things, and I'm going to rattle through them, and then hopefully we'll have some questions at the end. So first one, Avengers Unite. So I think there's something that's really interesting that's starting to happen, where a lot of brands are recognizing that these problems are bigger than self. They are big, systemic, structural, fuck-off issues that they can't solve on their own. And often what a lot of purpose campaigns do, or dare I say it, like social impact campaigns, will tie themselves to a cause, in fundamentally to help benefit the specific drivers of that brand or category. And what's happening in very progressive kind of organisations is they're going, we can't do this alone. We've got some skills gaps. So an example being this year, Allbirds and Adidas partnering to develop I can't remember what it's called now, Futurecraft, I think it's called, the shoe. Together, Allbirds and Adidas recognising their kind of comparative strengths. So Adidas had some very smart kind of sustainability creds. Allbirds has some deeper sustainability creds. Adidas had the distribution. Together, they've been able to reduce the carbon emissions of a high-performance sneaker trainer by 62%. And they did that in a year. They did that in a year by just coming together. Another example, Eat Them to Defeat Them, is a campaign you might be familiar with. It's kind of run for a few years. It's a campaign that's co-funded by, I think it's 10 supermarkets, or 9 out of the 10 biggest UK supermarkets. And that is a campaign which is fundamentally trying to get children to improve their relationship with vegetables. Now, of course, that has like wider ramifications for the planet. It also is a bit of a win-win for those individual supermarkets as well, because it's growing the category. They sold 18 million extra packs of vegetables as a consequence of coming together. And kind of creating those economies of scale in the advertising, in the marketing, and then kind of being able to sweep up and harvest that demand in store across all their stores. Number 2, be the influencer. I used to hear from a lot of clients, hey, well, this whole climate thing, we should probably just wait for the regulators to kind of come in, sort it out, set the market conditions. And that's increasingly bullshit. What happens, and this is a really interesting kind of model that's kind of been developed by the UN, a guy called Nigel Topping, big on Twitter in this world, and he talks a lot about ambition loops. And so what we as marketers can do is often, if we're working in the private sector, we can influence a lot of the ambition and how the science-based targets might show up in our advertising, the public updates on our progress that we're making, etc., etc. This is the type of messaging that we can influence as marketers. This then influences government climate policy because it creates the conditions and the confidence for policymakers to set new, interesting targets themselves, regulatory environments, incentives, and infrastructure. So even though I don't actually spend a lot of time with, many of my clients aren't in this space, what we're saying to them is, but you do kind of contribute. So, don't wait for the regulations. The regulators are often waiting for you. Cross the eco-chasm. So the whole crossing the chasm thing, which is about the technology adoption curve. So from early adopters into late majority. I think there's something similar for the adoption of environmental kind of behaviours. But I think there's a lesson, which is that most people, and when you're trying to cross the eco-chasm, most people aren't really thinking about saving the planet. Most people, most of the time, just trying to save the week. Particularly amongst, kind of lower socioeconomic groups or people at a certain age where they might kind of have to be caring for their parents as well as putting their kids through school. Oh, and by the way, they've been told that they are the, at a C-suite level or kind of leaders of industry, and it's on them to kind of like change and provide the U-turns in their place of work. So really, marketers need to make this whole movement feel easy and something that is achievable by a lot of people regularly and often. This is a campaign, you might have seen it from British Gas, which basically kind of frames the idea of being sustainable as part of daily living. Number 4, design for the win-win. This is more in the product space, in the product design space, where I think that there is an increasing appreciation for thinking about products that have like multiple wins to them. And the best example that I can think of a brand that is doing this and disrupting a whole category is Vitality. So Vitality are an insurance business. And essentially what their kind of proposition is, the win-win proposition is, hey, we'll help you be healthier and we'll lower your premiums because you're healthier. Now, I think there is a growing body of data that is emerging from the climate space, in particular carbon and people's carbon footprints, which very smart people, much smarter than me, will be able to design products and services that create that design for that win-win. So, I would love to see somebody who has got the smarts to work out how to incentivize flight choice via this new metric that started appearing in Google Flight searches. Or Doconomy is a credit app where they are kind of starting to calculate your exact kind of credit emissions, if you like, on what you're spending. So irrespective of how accurate some of this carbon data is, it's just interesting that it's emerging, it's becoming quite mainstream. And if I was a betting man, I'd start to put some very smart product developers around these types of data points to work out how to create the win-win. Number 5, imagine futures made of more, not less. So it's really interesting when you think about sustainability, because sustainability is often framed as doing less quite often, and doing less, which basically means compromise. And that kind of jars with like marketers, because we're kind of the optimists and we're very good at like selling more and kind of improving people's lots. And now this kind of like broader cultural narrative is like, hey, do less. And, kind of, it feels a life that feels more attritional. And I think where, again, kind of born out of how people responded to the climate crisis, to the COVID-19, people started to kind of get this realization that actually there are other kind of priorities, there's other good things that happen in life which are not so driven by, dare I say it, kind of, an ad's telling me to consume. So I've been involved with a group called Purpose Disruptors. They ran some research. They identified that actually what a good life might kind of feel and look like in 2030 might be one of greater connectedness. So connected to yourself, connected to others and connected to the natural world. And we've just done this video with Alice Levine, who's like a Radio 1 presenter and Channel 4 host, and she's kind of talking about basically what a good life in 2030 might entail. I might just skip on because it's 3 minutes long, and I know like we're pushed for time. So we actually launched this on Friday at COP, but it's in the deck, so please have a look at it when you can. Okay, number 6. Don't hope the truth away. So just on the point of like marketers being optimists, this is, I think, often, and I've been so guilty of this, where I've received a brief from a client and been so desperate for their climate claims to be true. Like so desperate to want to be associated personally with a brand that's like making like real interventions on the climate. And I've definitely been guilty of hoping the truth away. Just kind of like, you know, with a little bit of a zhuzh in the creative, we can kind of like get people, or the post-rationalization in the case study, no problem. And we can't do that. I think we are like the purveyors of truth and truth in the broadest sense and how we frame things. So we can't hope the truth away, because otherwise we're in trouble. And as David Attenborough says, you know, saving the planet is now a communications challenge. Lots of marketers around the world agree actually that we as a department versus other business functions, we are lagging behind. So this is some data taken from the World Federation of Advertisers, and it looks at marketers' views on where they are on their climate journey versus other organization functions. And you can kind of see that marketers are lagging behind. So there is that kind of appetite to catch up. And as I say, kind of hope that maybe some of the claims in the propositions that are being put forward and we're being asked to sell are just going to be good enough. And, you know, lots of these stats flying around, but marketers also around the world agree that we can make a difference, and so do people. Like lots of people kind of think that brands have the responsibility to kind of help them change behavior as well. So, you know, we've got to kind of hold ourselves to account. And the final point I'd make on don't hope the truth away is there is a lot of stuff. There's a lot of free stuff now circulating from various different industry bodies around what we brief, what we make, how we make it, and then how we measure it. Hello Mudatar. So I read an article by one of the Mother, so an ad agency in London called Mother, and their partner, one of their partners called Katie Mackay-Smith, and she talked about this idea of Mudatar, and I think it's brilliant. It basically means the pleasure that comes from delighting in other people's well-being, being happy that someone else is doing well. And again, as an industry, we're really bad at that. Like, we are really bad at that. My wife is, so my wife doesn't work in marketing, she's a doctor, and she has kind of remarked on, sometimes it takes an outsider to kind of look in and go, fucking hell, like, you snarky bastards. You know, and there's quite a lot of that in our industry, which is kind of needless, because a lot of the industry is kind of made up of lots of, you know, very important, clever people pontificating, and then it's made up of lots of people like at the coalface doing the do, and like there's sometimes a bit of a jar and a bit of a cultural a culture war almost, and across the disciplines and et cetera, and I just think we kind of need to channel the spirit of, you know, the Olympics this year, where, you know, I don't know if you could remember this story where for the high jump you had the Qatari and the Italian, I can't remember their names, like share the gold medal. There were kind of, haven't got the imagery, but there were like skateboard, like one of the first times it was Olympic sport, and all the skateboard Olympians were kind of supporting they were directly competing with each other, but it's just their culture. Their culture is to like support one another. That's how that culture, that sport operates. And I think we need to channel a bit more of this, because we don't really compete on the climate. I mean, if the climate's fucked, we're all fucked. But we can lift each other up, and we can accelerate each other and call out each other's greatness when it happens, whilst also kind of tempering each other's bullshit every once in a while, particularly on the greenwash point. So it's finding that balance. Number 8, get to know how your carbon mind print get to know your carbon mind print. So I mentioned before this ad, which was a campaign that was run by BP 2000, I think so the idea was born around 2004. It ran for a few years. That was a concept that was developed by an ad agency. The idea of a carbon footprint now is everywhere. I'm not saying that the idea of a carbon footprint is wrong. It really helps you measure and understand the immediate kind of impacts that you're making around, your choice of car, how much electricity you're using. I'm not saying it's a bad measure. It is important. But it is a little bit distracting because a carbon footprint is the here and now. A carbon mind print, I've just made that term up, so you can kind of perhaps call me out for the marketing bullshit. But actually, it's really important for us because a carbon mind print is your ability to influence in many different ways. So your consumption, so yeah, sure, your lifestyle expectations, your 2-day shipping, your carbon footprint, but also your broader choices. So what you do with your money, how are you investing your money? Do you know where your pension is? The number of children you have, the pets you have, etc., etc. The company I work for, and my attention. So how much of my attention is focused on the climate crisis? When we're cognizant of this broader kind of influence that we have, that will help us drive the collective and systemic change that we need. Because rather than just focus purely on your carbon footprint, it's a little bit distracting. I'll imagine a scenario where you've got one person who cycles to work and they work in advertising on a big oil major, and then you've got one person who flies every week, takes a domestic flight every week. And on face value, you might go, well, the person who flies every week's got a larger carbon footprint. But then what if I tell you that that person is convening a series of events, climate events for an NGO, and actually, I'm not saying one or the other, but it becomes slightly kind of murky as to how you're defining who's kind of contributing to net zero. Okay, nearly there. Number 9, measure what matters. So I'm fascinated with this. I think the accountants are going to make sense of purpose for us all. Brand purpose, I think the accountants are going to finally crack it. What they're doing in the world of finances, they're starting to do what they're very good at, is start to put some metrics and numbers around their businesses. And what they've devised is a calculation called a financed emission. So not just the emissions of their operations, like the Canary Wharf building, but also the money that they have invested in various different industries. So for example, they are now reporting in their accounting the financed emissions, so the money that they are putting into a coal plant and the emissions that coal plant is generating. What they found with this kind of measure, and it's not really that surprising, is that the total financed emissions from financial institutions were on average more than 700 times greater than the office lights. Advertising's, and they kind of, more stats. So yeah, very, very kind of impactful. This came out today. So there was a story in the Drum which talked about the effect of advertising as an industry. Effective ad campaigns are making the UK's carbon emissions problems worse. That's quite chastening. I'm a planner. I kind of get a pay rise if I do well at the FEs, and now I'm being told that that effort is also kind of detrimental to the planet. But actually, I think it's potentially a big breakthrough, because if we agree on, and this is what was being put forward at COP today, so a metric called advertised emissions, and the calculation is like relatively simple. So it's the amount spent on advertising, and then the advertising return on investment times by the greenhouse gas emissions per output of that thing that you've sold equals the advertiser emissions. If we as an industry start to kind of recognise a new way of measuring our true impact beyond just the Scope 1, Scope 2 operational impact that we have, then I think we will get to some very, very scary stats again on how that plays out. I think we'll get to like a much more interesting discussion around advertising's contribution to net zero. Okay, last one. Don't appoint an agency. And by that I mean, really, you have to create your own. And I found my own agency, so I found out my wife was pregnant a few months ago, and that has given me like a real kind of catalyst and rocket to kind of do talks like this, try to make and create a safe space for a conversation around climate that isn't, that kind of will breed like a healthy conversation rather than it just be a zero-sum kind of argument. And hopefully in my position working at McCann, like where, McCann has some big clients, some very kind of heavy emitting clients. I recognise that actually there is dare I say, a kind of a unique voice that I have in kind of being able to play and understand hopefully both sides of the argument. So don't hire an agency, create your own. So that's me. Thank you very much for listening. 10 roles for advertising the transition to net zero. Thank you.
Well done, mate.
Cheers, okay.